But when the Fed was first started in 1913, right, and this concept of price stability, right, that was part of the original goals of the Fed. They wanted price stability. But why? Because I think that was a mistake. Because falling prices are better than stable prices. I mean, ask any consumer if they'd rather pay lower prices than they paid last year or the same. Everybody would rather pay lower prices, right? I mean, that's reality. And that means that your standard of living is going up because your cost of living is going down. But getting me back to the CPI index that I wanted to mention, where 1967 is 100. In 1800, that index was at 51. 1800. In the year 1900, we're talking 100 years later, the index was at 25. 25. So consumer prices in 1900 were half of what they were in 1800. 100 years of deflation. Now, if you talk to an economist today, what would happen if prices fell for 100 years? Oh my God, it would be a 100-year depression. It would be the worst, thing imaginable, except it wasn't. Do people think the U.S. economy didn't grow between 1800 and 1900? I mean, come on. First of all, that included the Gilded Age, which is, after the Civil War to about 1900. That is the most prosperous period in economic history, the greatest amount of growth. But what happened to the U.S. economy between 1800 and 1900? First of all, in 1800, everybody was riding on horses. People had automobiles in 1900. No one had electricity in 1800. They had it in 1900. Right? Think about the transformation. Think about all the people that were living in cities that used to be living on farms, right? The whole industrial revolution. Think about all the manufactured products in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s that didn't exist, in 1800. Think about all the immigrants that came to this country in the 1880s and the 1890s, the millions and millions of people that the population exploded in the United States. Think about all this economic growth that we had in the 19th century in the United States, and prices went down. First of all, modern economists think that's impossible. They think, well, you have to have rising prices to have economic growth. Well, in the 19th century, we had more economic growth than the 20th century, and we had falling prices. Right? So clearly, you don't need rising prices to have economic growth. In fact, we had more economic growth when prices were falling than we did when prices are rising. And of course, falling prices are a good thing because that means your standard of living goes up. That means you can buy more stuff with less money. So we had 100 years of falling prices before we had a Federal Reserve, right? We were on a gold standard. We had real money, and prices were not just stable, prices went down. Right. And, I know today, like if anybody talks to their grandfather and they'll say, oh, I remember when prices were this or that, right? Prices were so much lower. Well, if you were a kid in 1900 and you were talking to your grandfather, it was the opposite conversation. Well, I remember when I was a kid, this was really expensive. And now look how cheap it is. Right. We have those conversations today when it comes to technology, right? When it comes to a cell phone or a laptop computer or television, we can tell our kids that, we actually used to pay more money for these things, but not so for most products, right? But back then, it was true for all products, right? We had a falling cost of living because we had real money and we didn't have a Federal Reserve. Now we have a Federal Reserve, and first they said we needed stable prices, and they gave us lots of inflation. They said that they were going to defend the value of the dollar, and the dollar collapsed, right? Well, now the same Fed, although different people, but the same institution is now abandoning the pretense of wanting stable prices. Now they say we need inflation, right? We need it like a hole in the head. Who needs inflation? The government needs inflation because the government is the world's biggest debtor, and inflation helps debtors eradicate their debt. Right? So the government needs inflation so it can screw its creditors by repaying them in debased money. Why else do we need inflation? To sustain asset prices, right? How do we keep the stock market going up? How do we keep real estate market going up? These are prices, stock prices, real estate prices. They want to sustain that inflation. They don't want prices to come down for financial assets, so they have to keep creating more and more inflation to sustain the bubbles. But why do we have the bubbles? Because the Federal Reserve inflated the bubbles. So now because they inflated the bubbles, everybody else has to suffer a diminished standard of living, a falling standard of living in order to prevent the music from stopping. I mean, because the Fed tries to pretend that this is all in our best interest. They keep saying that they're trying to help the American economy. They're trying to help the American consumer. In fact, what Powell said is he is trying to keep this expansion going for the benefit of the American economy. The expansion ending is what would benefit the American economy because this is not a genuine expansion. This is a bubble. And keeping the bubble from popping, enabling the bubble to get bigger and bigger and bigger is not good for the American economy. It's not good for anybody except the people who are speculating and profiting from the bubble. And of course, even those people are going to suffer because the bubble's going to pop and all their paper profits are going to vanish. And so they're not actually going to have anything to show for the bubble except the memories of profits they used to have and all the bad decisions that they made basically while they were operating under false assumptions that were created by the bubble itself and by the mispriced assets. In fact, Jim Grant, again, when they asked him, well, what would you do with interest rates if you were Fed chairman? What Jim Grant said is, well, I would let the market determine interest rates just the way the market determines the price of soybeans, which is exactly what I have been saying. You don't want the Federal Reserve and a bunch of people trying to guess what the right rate of interest is. No more than you want them to guess what the appropriate price of soybeans is. You don't need that. That's what we have a market for, right? We have a free market that discovers the price based on all the individual buyers and sellers. You still have that when it comes to interest rates because interest rates are the price of borrowing money. And it's going to be discovered as savers and borrowers interact with one another. The savers constitute the supply. People who are saving money, under consuming, they create supply. Then you have demand. Businesses who are looking to invest in capital goods, or maybe a homeowner who wants to buy a house, or somebody who wants to fund a college education. You have all sorts of reasons that people are borrowing money, and then people are saving money, and now you have supply and demand. And then let the market clear. What is the rate of interest that clears the supply of savings with a demand for those savings, and then let the market find the interest rate? That could happen without the Fed's interference. The problem is that the Fed got out of the way and let the market discover the rate of interest. Does anybody think it'd be where it is? No, it would be substantially higher than where it is. So we have artificially low interest rates. We don't have interest rates that are being determined by a free market. We have interest rates that are being, pulled out of a hat by a bunch of bureaucrats. And of course, they're not just pulling them randomly. They want interest rates low to sustain all these bubbles. But what they're doing is delaying the day of reckoning. They're sustaining the mistakes that are being made during the bubble. Why was the crisis in '08 so bad? Because there were a lot of mistakes made when the Fed had interest rates at 1%. There were a lot of malinvestments. There was a lot of misallocation of resources because interest rates were artificially low. Well, they're still artificially low. In fact, they were much lower for much longer this time. So the number of mistakes that were made were greater. The size of those mistakes were greater. So we have a more screwed up economy right now with more misallocations, more malinvestments, and all the Federal Reserve is doing is trying to sustain that, trying to keep that going, right? Trying to allow the patient to get sicker and sicker and sicker because the medicine doesn't taste good. Well, if you avoid taking the medicine long enough, you're going to die. And I'd rather swallow a bitter tasting medicine than just die from some disease because I don't want to deal with the bad taste. But this is the political reality of what's going on. And Donald Trump knows this. That's why he's out there saying that we need to cut interest rates and we need to do more quantitative easing. He's worried that we get some of that taste before the 2020 election. And then, the electorate barfs out and ends up going for a socialist.